rock and roll. It got popular in the 1950s and ruled the music world throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. Where did it come from? Where did it go? Hi, I'm Henry Mateus, also known as Stick Dog Hank. Thanks for tuning in. Today's video is about the origin of rock and roll music and the artists that contributed to its invention. Rock and roll did not appear out of nowhere. It began as a mix of rhythms and structures of African American blues and R&B, as well as the energy of country music, often labeled as hillbilly music. The musicians and singers that pioneered rock and roll music were simply experimenting with blues, R&B, country, and gospel music. They were feeling and mixing the rhythms and creating new beats for their original and sometimes cover songs. The rock and roll sound was driven by a strong, amplified beat with simple chord progressions, and the main focus was the energy and rebellion of youth. No single artist invented rock and roll. There were several pioneers of rock and roll music. Think about it for a minute. There was never a news conference or anything where somebody stepped up to the microphone and said, "I have invented a new style of music and I call it rock and roll." It wasn't like that. Rock and roll evolved from out of the late 1940s and into the 1950s. The main pioneers of rock and roll were Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Bill Haley, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, Little Richard, and Elvis Presley. At least they are the artists that have received most of the credit, but there were some others before them. Okay, so how did it all start? What was the first rock and roll record, and who recorded it? It is and will always be debatable, but most music historians will say it was Rocket 88, recorded in Memphis, Tennessee in 1951 by Jackie Brenston and his Delta Cats. That's what it said on the record label, but in reality, it was Ike Turner and his Kings of Rhythm. The reason it was credited the way it was is because the saxophone player, Jackie Brenston, provided the lead vocal, while Ike Turner led the band, which were his Kings of Rhythm. The single reached #1 on the Billboard R&B chart. Of course, there was no rock music or rock and roll chart yet.
You women have heard of jalopies, you've heard the noise they make, but let me introduce my new Rocket 88.
Now, Brenston later said that the song was not all that original. They had borrowed, or some musicians might say, ripped off, from another jump blues about a car called Cadillac Boogie by Jimmy Liggins.
Mr. Cadillac Boogie, boogie woogie rolling along.
Rocket 88 was about a new car model by Oldsmobile, the Oldsmobile Rocket 88. The styles at that time were called jump blues and swing combo music. Turner made the style a bit more raw and dirty by using distorted guitar for the very first time ever on a record, played by Willie Kizart, and very enthusiastic vocals by Jackie Brenston. The song was brash and sexy. The lyrics were about cars, sex, and partying. It resonated with audiences and helped pave the way for the rock and roll explosion. The following are reasons why Rocket 88 is considered such an important song. 1, it features a fast tempo and a driving rhythm that was more energetic than the tempos common in blues and jazz of that time. 2, the distorted guitar, which was an accident because the amplifier got damaged just before the recording session. 3, it showcased a strong driving rhythm that heavily influenced later rock and roll artists. 4, the sexy lyrics about cars, freedom, and having a good time were very different than the blues themes of the time. 5, the song reached #1 on the Billboard R&B chart, proving its popularity and appeal. Now, some will argue, and you can definitely make a case for other songs like Good Rockin' Tonight by Roy Brown or Strange Things Happening Every Day by Sister Rosetta Tharpe. But most rock music artists and historians will agree that Rocket 88 wins the debate, especially because you can hear the influence on the music by Chuck Berry and Little Richard. Okay, so now we know how the rock and roll sound started, but what about the name rock and roll? Where did that come from? The phrase rock and roll was a euphemism for sex in African American slang in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Radio disc jockey Alan Freed is credited with popularizing the phrase in the early 1950s by using it to describe the style of music he was playing on his radio show, which included a mix of R&B, blues, and country. So hear me out. Rocket 88 is considered by most to be the first rock and roll record, but at the time of its release and popularity, there wasn't a rock and roll style of music yet. Rocket 88 was an R&B song, and it hit number 1 on the Billboard R&B chart. Rock and roll music and rock and roll records evolved over a few years until we got a clear rock and roll style and rock and roll artists. No one ever stepped up to the microphone and said, "This is the first rock and roll song you will ever hear." It didn't happen overnight, so at some point, people began calling it rock and roll artists began to surface. This next thing is also debatable and could be a matter of opinion, but the fact is, Fats Domino had a hit record before Chuck Berry and Little Richard. It was called The Fat Man, released in 1949.
They call me the Fat Man, 'cause I weigh 200 pounds.
It sold over 1 million copies. Chuck Berry's first major hit was Maybelline, released in 1955.
Maybelline, why can't you be true?
Little Richard had a huge hit, Tutti Frutti, also released in 1955.
Womp bom balloon bom 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 tutti frutti. Oh,
Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis Presley was released in 1956.
Well, it's down at the end of Lonely Street, that Heartbreak Hotel where I'll be.
So what was the first number 1 rock and roll song on the Billboard chart? Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and His Comets, released in 1955. It became a massive hit after it was featured in the 1955 movie Blackboard Jungle, starring Glenn Ford and Sidney Poitier.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, rock. We're gonna rock around the clock tonight.
As far as rock and roll goes, it was still in its infancy, and there was not a lot of competition yet. Here is a list of the top 30 songs of 1955 according to record sales. Not a lot of rock and roll artists on that list. Now here's a list from 1956. Now we can see a bit of growth in the popularity of rock and roll, mainly because of Elvis Presley. He really dominated record sales, which is one of the many reasons that he is considered the king of rock and roll. Like I said earlier, the first number 1 rock and roll single was Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets. But the first number 1 rock and roll album was by Elvis Presley, his debut album. Now, of course, by 1957, rock and roll is growing and becoming more popular. Here's a list for 1957. Here's a list for 1958. And also 1959, as we see, there's more and more rock and roll artists showing up on the chart. 1960. So rock and roll continued to grow in many ways, and Elvis dominated the charts in the late 50s. By 1962, we had great rock and roll singers and groups like the Four Seasons, the Beach Boys, Ray Charles, Neil Sedaka, Dion, Chubby Checker, the Shirelles, just to name a few.
Catch a wave and you're sitting on top of the world.
The Beach Boys and Four Seasons were the big rock and roll acts of 1963.
Sherry baby.
Then in 1964 came the Beatles.
I wanna hold your hand. I wanna hold your hand.
They dominated the charts until 1970.
Here comes the sun. I say it's alright.
We also had other great bands like the Rolling Stones, The Doors, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Three Dog Night, The Monkees, The list goes on and on. I love rock and roll music. I always have, and I always will. Please watch my rock music videos right here on my YouTube channel at Stick Dog Hank. Rock and roll will never die was a very popular phrase when I was a kid, and most of us believed it to be true. Unfortunately, rock and roll is not nearly as popular as it used to be. Neil Young sang about it in his song, Hey Hey My, Into the Black, where he says,
Rock and roll can never die.
I hope it never does die, but most young people today prefer hip-hop and rap. Although rock and roll is not completely dead, I fear that soon it just might be. Rock and roll evolved into a broader variety of styles under the blanket of rock music. It gave us hard rock, acid rock, progressive rock, punk rock, heavy metal, hardcore, etc. I think Billy Joel said it best in his song, It's Still Rock and Roll to Me.
Hot funk, cool punk, even if it's old junk, it's still rock and roll to me.
This video is not a complete history of rock music. I simply wanted to tell my viewers how rock and roll began. There have been so many great rock groups and artists from the 1950s to the turn of the century. Some of them still perform here in Las Vegas and all over the world. Still performing are Journey, John Fogerty, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, U2, The Beach Boys, Elton John, Rolling Stones, Rick Springfield, Iron Maiden, and many others. Please go see them perform before they retire. Rock on, my friends. Rock and roll forever. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe.